Today is going to be another installment from the Emotional Anarchy series, but I promise tomorrow there will be a more anarchy-related video to break up the uploads from this series. So let's get into Chapter 6, Addiction and Withdrawal. I am not going to moralize about drugs in this chapter because illegal drugs can be medicinal and prescribed drugs can be abused. Drugs are tools, inherently neutral. It's about how effectively they're used, not what they are. Before I get too deep into this chapter, I want to start by dispelling some harmful myths about addiction. Addiction is not about your behavior. It's about your biology and your environment. Suffering from addiction is no more morally questionable than suffering from depression or lupus. You didn't choose for your body to behave this way, nor did you fully get to choose your environments. There are a lot of theories about what causes addiction, but the most often agreed upon one is twofold. One is a predisposition to increased dopamine receptor availability on the D2 receptor subtype. That's medical jargon for some people are born with extra happy buttons in their brain. When something triggers a happy response, whether it's a drug or gambling or sex or food or whatever stimulus of significant intensity, these folks get a really big rush of dopamine. Dopamine has a lot of different functions, but you know about it because one of them is euphoria. The brain responds to big, unexpected influxes of any particular neurotransmitter by down-regulating the most overwhelmed receptors. So your brain is like, whoa, that is too many happy buttons. Let's take away some of these buttons. We really don't need this many. That leads to a seeking behavior because you go in expecting the same rush and you don't get it. You need more of the same stimulus to get the same feeling. This can happen to folks from drinking moderately for the first time, taking certain drugs as prescribed by a doctor, or engaging in any number of typical activities within normal restraint. Some folks are predisposed to be more sensitive to these dopamine rushes. Two people could do the same drug in the same amount, and one could walk away indifferent while the other becomes addicted. It's not just about you or your choices. It's about how your brain is built. But that's not the only thing it's about. That's really only half the story, maybe even less. The real story is your environment, and how often everyday things give you small rushes of dopamine on a regular basis. In other words, if your environment is miserable, and the only way you feel reliable joy is with some kind of external aid, and you have a huge capacity for feeling that joy, which you can't often feel, you're perfectly set up for addiction. This was best explained in the 70s by psychologist Dr. Bruce Alexander in the Rat Park experiments. If you haven't heard about him or this work, I really recommend you look him up, but I'll briefly summarize them here. Dr. Bruce realized that the subject animals in his drug research, rats, who are naturally communal, social, playful animals, are housed alone and spend their entire lives with no social activity and no enrichment toys. Then, when used in the research, they're given a choice between normal water or drug-laced water, and the rats can be observed choosing the drug water obsessively over food, often until death. This was taken as proof of how dangerous and debilitating these addictive drugs were. But Dr. Bruce had a different explanation. He postulated that it was the rats' miserable environment that encouraged them to choose the drug, an instant happy shot, over a longer, miserable existence. To test his theory, he built Rat Park, an enclosure 80 times larger than a typical cage. Rats in Rat Park were allowed to socialize, take mates, raise pups. After socializing the animals in Rat Park, Dr. Bruce again gave them the choice between the drugged water or the regular water. But this time, most of the rats did not choose the drug at all, and the ones that did so intermittently and without obsession. None of the rats overdosed. Considering that this experiment and several other iterations, including versions where they took rats who had been raised in the smaller cages, gotten addicted to a drug, and then put into Rat Park, and most rats still showed favorable results within a week. Although keep in mind, these timelines are for rats and aren't literal comparisons for human recovery, but considering the fact that rats are capable of modeling addiction, these results are worth looking into. This took place in the 70s. You'd think by 2020 we'd have seen that reflected in our drug policy, but of course we haven't, because the war on drugs has never been about public health. The salient takeaways from this, in my opinion, are that no one chooses to be an addict, and the environment that they're in dictates their capacity for recovery. So if there's an addict in your life, please remember that you can do them much more good by loving them than judging them. Now, let's talk about withdrawals. Withdrawal can be a more dangerous aspect of addiction than overdose, but going cold turkey is seen as some kind of virtue, so nobody likes to talk about how damaging withdrawals can be. Not only are cold turkey drops terrible for your brain and body, and in some cases can be deadly, they are the least successful method of long-term abstinence. Tapering off the drug you are dependent on is the best, safest, and most sustainable approach. And this is true whether you're coming off of caffeine, nicotine, Xanax, heroin, etc. The right tapering schedule for you is going to vary based on your usage habits, but a good rule of thumb is to take the smallest step down you can. So if you're used to smoking 20 cigarettes a day, drop that to 18 or 19 per day, then hold at that new level for a little while, up to 2 weeks, if that drop is particularly hard to maintain. Then drop down one more step, and again, hold there until it isn't hard to maintain, and so on, until you can get down to 0. If you're taking a prescription medication, you're locked into whatever dose pills they make, but get the smallest step down available. Proceeding like this won't eliminate withdrawals, but it can minimize them to tolerable levels. I also recommend specifically looking up the known withdrawal effects of the particular substance you're coming off of, even if it's a prescription, even if it's a common recreational drug like caffeine, and you think you know what the withdrawals will be like, look them up. There are very likely ones you've never heard about, and although you won't necessarily experience every possible effect, it's better to know in case you do experience less common withdrawal effects, so you'll understand what's happening to you, which can make it easier to cope than if it feels like weird symptoms are suddenly coming out of nowhere for no reason. Even seemingly mundane drugs like caffeine can cause severe withdrawals, especially in a cold turkey drop. So I can't stress enough how important it is to carefully research the possible withdrawals associated with the substance you're withdrawing from, especially if you don't have the option of tapering down. I like to conceptualize the withdrawal experience as a little horrible gremlin sitting on your shoulder constantly shrieking at you. It's important to remember that many of the thoughts and feelings you're having are not who you are. They are something that is happening to you. And although in some cases they can go on for a while, they are ultimately temporary. The only other thing I want to mention in this chapter is a reiteration of the fact that drugs are tools. And tools can be used well, can be life-saving, and tools used improperly can be damaging. Unfortunately, capitalism has weaseled its way into healthcare, and doctors are human, often overworked, underpaid, highly stressed humans, and there have been many cases of doctors prescribing medications not based on the needs of their patients, but based on which company is willing to give them kickbacks. This practice is not legal, but it is rampant in the United States. If you feel like your doctor isn't listening to you, and the drug you've been prescribed isn't working for you, don't be afraid to find a new doctor and get another opinion. If you know your brain best. If you're not seeing results and your doctor insists you have to stay the course for reasons they can't articulate to you, be empowered to take your business elsewhere, because there may be less than honorable reasons why they want to give you one particular drug over another. If you want to know if your doctor has received payments from a drug or medical device company, you can look them up here with their full name, city, and zip code, and I'll link that in the description. On the flip side, you may also run into doctors who err on the side of overcaution and are unwilling to give you the tools you need due to the associations with that particular drug. Never be ashamed to seek a second opinion. If you do need to seek a second doctor, do not take a referral from the office who denied you. They will very likely include a note in your chart about drug-seeking behavior, ensuring you'll hit the same roadblocks in a new office. I'm going to add one extra note here about caffeine in particular. I've decided to revisit this chapter because even though I referenced how severe caffeine withdrawals can be, I've talked to too many people before who honestly had no idea what they can really be like. So let's just take a second and do a deep dive here. Let me just step on my soapbox. Caffeine is a drug, and drugs, as I have mentioned, are tools. Tools that should be used correctly and with all the pertinent information available to you. Sudden cessation of caffeine will result in withdrawal symptoms. The higher the typical dose of caffeine, the more severe the withdrawals will be. Although they usually start immediately, there can sometimes be up to a 2-week delay before you feel the full force of the withdrawals. A small cup of coffee, average of about 100 milligrams of caffeine per day for a week, is sufficient to produce withdrawals if suddenly stopped. Caffeine withdrawals are not always just a headache and a bad mood. They mimic the withdrawals from any stimulant, such as chills or hot spells, decreased alertness, depressed mood, heightened anxiety or panic, body tremors, difficulty concentrating, digestive issues, usually constipation, but sometimes also nausea or vomiting, fatigue, lethargy, sleeplessness, fatigue, lethargy, sleepiness. Headaches ranging from moderate to severe. They usually start behind the eyes before spreading. Irritability, moderate to extreme, and restlessness. Insomnia, although it might seem counterintuitive, this can be an issue for some people. Muscle stiffness or pain. Sinus problems, usually blocked sinuses or cold-like symptoms. I'm not saying you shouldn't use caffeine. I personally don't care which drugs you use or why you use them. I do care that you understand what those drugs can do so you can use those tools at your disposal safely and effectively. I'm saying you shouldn't use caffeine and then suddenly stop using caffeine and then worry that you've suddenly developed some new mental illness when in reality you are experiencing well-documented withdrawals from our society's favorite drug. I am so sick of meeting new people who are having these severe, bizarre, sudden symptoms only to discover they've recently gone cold turkey off of a high dose of caffeine. One of the many reasons why I hate fad detox diets that encourage cold turkey drops with absolutely no warning about the severity of the withdrawals they cause. Because no one ever told you to expect significant severe withdrawals from caffeine. When they reintroduce caffeine and slowly reduce it, those symptoms typically vanish or reduce to tolerable levels. If you want to get off caffeine and don't have a medically urgent reason to go cold turkey, taper down. Treat it like you would any other drug. Slowly reduce your usage and you will avoid many sleepless nights filled with mysterious sobbing and panic.